Human wrapped the frozen alien girl in his only coat and her tribe hunted him for mercy. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Jake Reynolds had never imagined that a simple decision would set him on a path that would change everything. A day that started with a routine survey of an icy, desolate planet turned into a life-altering choice. He had been stranded on this frozen world for a few days, conducting research on its strange minerals when a powerful snowstorm hit, one that could kill any unprepared soul within minutes. As Jake trudged through the snow, his boots sinking deep into the freezing powder, he noticed a figure lying motionless in the distance. It was a woman, her form almost entirely obscured by snow and frost. At first, he thought it was just a pile of debris, maybe the remnants of an old exploration mission or a casualty of the storm. But as he drew closer, he could see the shape clearly: an alien girl, her body frozen in place, her skin a strange shade of green, with shimmering, almost iridescent patterns beneath the surface. Her hair was long, flowing, and silver, contrasting against the stark white of the snow. Jake's heart raced. He knew better than to approach a stranger in this environment, but the sight of her, so vulnerable and helpless, sparked something deep inside him. He couldn't just leave her here to die. Without a second thought, Jake removed his only coat, a heavy, insulated garment designed to withstand the brutal cold, and wrapped it around the alien girl's fragile body. Her skin felt colder than anything he had ever touched before, and as he pulled her close to him, he could hear the faintest tremor of her breath. He wasn't sure what he was doing, whether it was foolish or brave, but he couldn't let her perish in this unforgiving storm. He carried her back to the makeshift shelter he had set up, his hands shaking from the cold and from the enormity of the situation. The girl's eyes fluttered open as Jake laid her down on the bedroll, the warmth from his coat slowly enveloping her. She looked up at him, confused, disoriented, and a little afraid. Jake tried to reassure her with a soft, "You're safe now. I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't respond, only stared at him, her golden eyes filled with uncertainty and disbelief. Her race was unfamiliar to him, and he wasn't sure if they were even capable of understanding human language. But there was something about her gaze, a quiet recognition, as if she understood that he had saved her life. However, Jake didn't realize the trouble he was about to face. The girl he had rescued was not just any alien wanderer, she was from the Sarvani tribe, a warrior culture known for its strict codes of conduct and unforgiving nature. Helping one of their own, especially a female, was seen as a profound violation of their traditions. Before Jake could even process what was happening, the ground beneath his feet shook as several figures emerged from the storm. The Sarvani warriors, tall and imposing, their faces hidden beneath armor, surrounded the shelter. Their eyes glowed with a fierce intensity, and their presence sent a chill down Jake's spine. They had come not to thank him for saving one of their own, but to exact punishment. Their laws were absolute, and by rescuing her, Jake had inadvertently defied their most sacred rule: no outsider could interfere with their people. One of the warriors stepped forward, his voice deep and commanding, "You have broken our code, human. For your mercy, you will pay the price." Jake's heart pounded as the tribe's leader approached, a figure that exuded authority and power. But Jake stood his ground, the image of the girl, now safe under his coat, flashing in his mind. He knew he had done the right thing, but he didn't know if it would be enough to save him from the wrath of the Sarvani. He glanced back at the alien girl, hoping that somehow, she might be able to explain his actions to them. But she remained silent, her eyes filled with uncertainty. What would happen now? Could his act of kindness save him, or would it bring down the full force of the Sarvani tribe on him? The story was just beginning, and Jake had no idea where it would take him next. Jake stood silently, feeling the weight of the Sarvani warriors' gaze on him. The air was thick with tension, their armored forms looming over him like an unstoppable force. He knew the risk of helping this alien girl, but he hadn't hesitated for a second. The way she looked at him, with those wide, golden eyes, still lingered in his mind. To her, he was a stranger, but to him, saving her life had felt like the only thing he could do in that moment. Now, standing face to face with the warriors, he wasn't so sure if his choice had been wise. The leader of the tribe stepped forward, his presence as commanding as his voice. His eyes were cold, assessing, but there was a certain flicker of curiosity in them. "You have saved her, human," the leader's voice rumbled, low and steady. "But that act, that mercy, is not yours to give." Jake didn't flinch. "I didn't ask for permission," he replied, his voice even. "I did what anyone would have done." The Sarvani warrior's gaze hardened, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned to Lyra, who had remained silent, sitting quietly under the coat Jake had given her. Her eyes were locked on the leader, her body trembling slightly, but her expression was unreadable. It was clear she was afraid, but it was just as clear that she didn't want Jake to face the consequences of her actions. She stood slowly, her body still fragile, and took a step toward the warrior leader. "It was my choice," Lyra said softly, her voice trembling. "He saved me. He didn't deserve punishment for that." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was a quiet tension that stretched between the two parties. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected her to speak up for him, especially not in the face of her own people. The leader of the Sarvani tribe regarded her silently, as if weighing her words carefully. Finally, he spoke. "You would speak for this human?" he asked, his voice steady. "For one who has no place among us?" Lyra nodded, her golden eyes meeting the leader's unflinchingly. "Yes," she said simply. Jake watched her, feeling a surge of gratitude that he couldn't quite put into words. She didn't have to do this for him, but she was. The leader of the Sarvani tribe remained silent for a long moment, the tension in the air palpable. Then, with a small but significant movement, he nodded. "You will not face punishment, human," the leader said, his voice heavy with authority. "But know this, there are consequences for actions like yours. The Sarvani do not tolerate interference from outsiders." Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He nodded, trying to maintain a respectful composure. "I understand," he said, his voice steady. The leader turned to his warriors. "Take her back to the tribe," he commanded. Lyra stepped forward, but before she could move, she turned to Jake. Her eyes were filled with gratitude, and for a moment, their gazes met. No words were exchanged, but in that fleeting moment, Jake understood. The leader of the Sarvani tribe gestured for Lyra to follow, and the warriors began to move. As they disappeared into the snow, Jake stood still, his thoughts racing. The storm had calmed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. He had saved her life, but now, he was left with the uneasy feeling that his act of mercy had set into motion something far larger than he had anticipated. Jake stood alone in the snow, his mind racing. The Sarvani warriors had left, taking Lyra back to their tribe, but the tension in the air still hung heavy. The storm had finally subsided, leaving a quiet stillness in its wake. His thoughts drifted back to the moment he had saved her, to the unexpected connection they had shared in the freezing cold. He had done what he thought was right, but now he wondered if it had been enough. The tribe's leader had spared him, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to come. He had helped a stranger, a creature from another world, and in return, had earned the wrath of a powerful tribe. Would they come for him again? Would they take more than just his life? He had no way of knowing. The uncertainty gnawed at him, but the cold and isolation of the planet had a way of making him focus on what he could control. He turned and made his way back to his shelter, the wind still biting at his skin. Inside, he found the warmth he had been seeking, but it was fleeting. As he stoked the fire and sat down on the cold stone floor, his thoughts returned to Lyra. What was her fate now? Had his act of kindness been enough to change the course of her life? Or would her people turn on her for speaking out in his defense? The quiet crackling of the fire filled the silence, and Jake closed his eyes, exhausted. He needed to rest, but sleep came reluctantly, filled with fragmented dreams of alien landscapes and strange faces. Hours later, the silence was broken by a knock at the door. Jake's eyes snapped open, his heart racing. He stood quickly, reaching for his rifle, but hesitated. The knock came again, louder this time. He moved cautiously toward the door, his breath shallow in his chest. When he opened it, he was met with a familiar face. Lyra! She was standing in the doorway, her silver hair glowing faintly in the dim light of the shelter, her expression unreadable. "I thought you'd be gone," Jake said, his voice a mixture of surprise and relief. Lyra didn't respond immediately, her eyes flicking over him as if searching for something. "I couldn't leave," she said quietly. "Not after what happened. I had to see you." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He stepped aside to let her in, his mind racing with questions. What was she doing here? Hadn't the warriors told her to return to her tribe? Lyra entered, her movements slow and deliberate, as if the weight of the world was on her shoulders. She closed the door behind her, the sound of it locking shut echoing through the small space. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything. You didn't deserve what happened." Jake shook his head, his expression softening. "You don't have to apologize," he said gently. "I saved you because I wanted to. I didn't think about the consequences." Lyra looked at him, her golden eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "The tribe," she began, her voice breaking slightly. "They won't forgive me for what I did. They'll never accept a human, especially one who broke our laws. I'm an outcast now. And it's because of you." Jake felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest. "That wasn't what I wanted," he said quietly. "But I can't change what's happened. Neither can you." She nodded slowly, her gaze falling to the floor. "I know," she whispered. "But I'm not going back. I can't. I'll die if I do." Jake moved closer to her, his hand reaching out to rest gently on her shoulder. "Then you'll stay here," he said, his voice firm. "You don't have to face this alone." Lyra's eyes met his, her expression one of quiet gratitude. For the first time, she looked at him not as a stranger, but as someone who had truly given her a chance at survival. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over them both. Outside, the wind howled once more, but inside the shelter, there was a quiet sense of peace. Jake didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he knew that he had made the right choice. No matter what came next, he would face it with Lyra by his side. Jake and Lyra spent the next few days in a strange, uneasy peace. The quiet of the shelter, once a stark reminder of his isolation, now felt different. Lyra's presence brought a sense of warmth, but it also reminded him of the danger they were both in. The Sarvani warriors had warned him, and the fear of their return hung over him like a storm cloud. Lyra had adjusted to life in the shelter quickly, though she still seemed distant at times, lost in thought. Jake couldn't blame her. After all, she had been cast out by her own people, a fate he could only imagine. He had tried to reassure her, telling her that she was safe now, but her quiet moments spoke volumes. She was clearly struggling with the weight of what had happened. Jake spent his days trying to keep their shelter secure, keeping watch over the horizon in case the Sarvani came for them. He had no idea how long they could hide here, but he knew they had to make the most of their time. He was a man used to survival, but this situation was unlike anything he had ever faced. Lyra, despite her quiet nature, had proven to be resourceful. She had an innate understanding of the environment, her knowledge of the alien planet's flora and fauna surprisingly vast. She often wandered into the nearby forest to gather supplies, her silver hair glinting in the dim light as she moved with grace and purpose. Jake admired her strength, even though she didn't always show it. One morning, after a night of restless sleep, Jake woke to find the shelter unusually quiet. Lyra was gone. He quickly grabbed his coat and stepped outside, scanning the snow-covered landscape for any sign of her. His heart raced. Where had she gone? As he ventured further from the shelter, he spotted her in the distance, crouched near a group of strange, spiny bushes. She was gathering something, but there was something different in her posture, something urgent. Jake walked toward her cautiously. "Lyra," he called softly. She looked up, her golden eyes meeting his with a mixture of surprise and something else, relief. "I was just getting some herbs," she said quietly, standing up slowly. "I found something that might help us." Jake nodded, But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her sudden disappearance. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Lyra hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm fine," she said, her voice tight. "I just needed some time." Jake didn't push her further. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of everything she had been through. "Well, I'm glad you're back," he said. "Let's head back to the shelter before the weather gets worse." Lyra nodded silently, and they made their way back together. The rest of the day passed without incident. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the landscape, Jake's unease returned. It wasn't just the Sarvani tribe that he had to worry about. There was something else in the air, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The following evening, as they sat around the fire in the shelter, Lyra turned to him with a look of determination in her eyes. "Jake, there's something you need to know," she said, her voice steady. Jake raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Lyra took a deep breath. "The Sarvani tribe isn't just about tradition," she said quietly. "They have their own codes, their own rules, but they also have a reason for everything. And they don't take mercy lightly." Jake frowned, his concern growing. "What do you mean?" "I think," she paused, searching for the right words, "they'll come for us again. Not just because of what you did for me, but because of something bigger." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Bigger? What are you saying?" Lyra's expression was grim. "The Sarvani don't forgive easily. And they're not just a tribe. They're part of something far more dangerous." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He had known the Sarvani were powerful, but now he understood that there was more at play than he had realized. His rescue of Lyra was just the beginning. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for what was coming next. Jake sat in silence, the crackling fire before him the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. His mind was racing, each word Lyra had spoken lingering in his thoughts like a shadow he couldn't shake. The Sarvani were not just a tribe, they were part of something much larger, something dangerous. He had only meant to help a stranger, a girl lost in the storm, but now he found himself tangled in a web far beyond his understanding. Lyra, who had been so strong and independent since the moment he met her, now seemed distant, as though something was weighing heavily on her. He could feel the shift, the subtle tension between them, even though she didn't speak much about it. She had been right to warn him. The tribe wouldn't stop at a simple act of mercy. Jake had known that saving her wasn't without consequences, but he hadn't realized how far-reaching those consequences could be. He was a man of action, used to surviving in the harshest environments, but this was different. This was personal. He had saved Lyra's life, and now, the fear of what the Sarvani might do to him, what they might do to both of them, seemed inevitable. He had to make a plan. Jake looked across the fire at Lyra, who sat on the opposite side, her eyes distant as she stared into the flames. He had to know more. He had to understand exactly what they were facing if they were going to survive this. "Lyra," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the silence. She turned to face him, her eyes slightly wide as though she had been lost in thought. "What do you know about the Sarvani beyond their codes? What's really going on with them?" Lyra hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice soft but clear. "The Sarvani are not just warriors. They are part of a larger alliance, one that spans across many systems. The alliance is powerful, and their reach is long. They're involved in many things: resources, diplomacy, even military operations." Jake listened carefully, trying to process the magnitude of what she was saying. "So, it's not just about tradition," he said slowly, his mind racing. "It's about control. Power." Lyra nodded. "Yes. The Sarvani tribe answers to the Dominion. And the Dominion does not tolerate weakness." Jake stood up, walking over to the window. He could feel the weight of her words in the pit of his stomach. He had put himself in a dangerous situation, and now, there was no going back. "What does that mean for us?" he asked, looking out at the dark expanse of the alien world. Lyra followed him, standing just behind him. "It means that if they come for us, they won't stop until we're gone. They will see this as a threat. To them, you're not just a human. You're an outsider who has interfered with their ways. Jake clenched his fists, frustration rising within him. He had tried to do the right thing, to help someone in need, and now he was facing the consequences of a decision he couldn't undo. But there was something in Lyra's voice that kept him grounded. She wasn't giving up. She wasn't ready to let him go. And that gave him hope. We can't just wait for them to come, Jake said firmly, turning back to face her. We need to do something. Lyra nodded, her expression resolute. We will. But we have to be smart. We can't fight them head-on. Not yet. Jake knew she was right. He didn't have the resources to take on the Sarvani tribe. They would have to be careful, strategic. Then we'll find a way to stay one step ahead, he said, determination flooding his chest. We won't let them win. Lyra's gaze softened as she looked at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. I knew I wasn't the only one who wouldn't back down. Jake smiled back, though the weight of what lay ahead still lingered in his mind. But with Lyra by his side, he knew they had a fighting chance. Together, they could face whatever the Sarvani tribe and the Dominion threw their way. The night was still and silent again, but for Jake and Lyra, it was a moment of peace, however brief. Tomorrow, they would face the unknown together, and that was all they could do for now. Jake and Lyra spent the next few days planning, their time divided between preparing for the worst and trying to understand their options. The fire crackled softly in the shelter, casting long shadows on the walls as they worked together in silence. Jake had always been a man of action, but this situation required a different approach. He couldn't just fight his way out of this one. The Sarvani were too powerful, too ingrained in their ways to be defeated with force alone. And the Dominion, which Lyra had warned him about, was something Jake wasn't sure he could even begin to understand. He paced the small room, thinking about their next move. They couldn't stay hidden forever. They needed to find a way to protect themselves. As Jake turned to look at Lyra, he noticed she was no longer looking at him, but out the window, her eyes distant. You're thinking about your people, aren't you? He asked, his voice soft. Lyra didn't immediately respond, but her eyes flicked back to him, and he saw the sadness there. I think about them every day, she said quietly. But I know they won't ever accept me back. Not after what I've done. They'll see me as a traitor, no matter what. Jake felt a pang of sympathy for her, but he knew he couldn't fix this for her. What he could do was help her survive, help them both survive. We don't need them, Jake said, his tone firm. We'll make our own way. We don't have to go back to a place that doesn't want us. Lyra's gaze softened, but she still seemed uncertain. It's not that easy, she replied. The Sarvani will come for us. And when they do, they won't just bring warriors. They'll bring the full force of the Dominion. They won't stop until we're both gone. Jake's mind raced as he processed what she was saying. The full force of the Dominion? That meant more than just a tribe. That meant an empire, one that spanned entire systems. How could they possibly stand against something that powerful? But he couldn't let fear dictate their choices. Not now. He had made a promise to Lyra, and he would keep. We don't need to fight them head-on, Jake said slowly. But we do need to make sure we're ready. We need a plan. Lyra nodded, her expression determined. You're right, she said, the fire in her eyes returning. We need to get to the outpost. It's the only place where we can get the supplies we'll need to escape. Jake looked at her, a little surprised. The outpost? Lyra nodded again, her silver hair falling around her face as she spoke. It's an old research station. It's been abandoned for years, but it's still functional. We can use it to get in touch with other systems, maybe even find a way off this planet. Jake thought for a moment. It made sense. If they could reach the outpost, they could find a way to escape, to leave the Sarvani and the Dominion behind. But it wouldn't be easy. The outpost was miles away, deep in the wilderness, and getting there would require navigating through hostile terrain. And the longer they waited, the more likely it was that the Sarvani would find them. We leave at first light, Jake said, his voice resolute. We'll get to the outpost. And we'll figure out the rest once we're there. Lyra's eyes locked with his, and for a moment, there was no uncertainty, no fear. Just the quiet understanding between them that they had to move forward. Together. The night passed slowly, each of them lost in their own thoughts as they prepared for the journey ahead. In the morning, they gathered their things, packed the necessary supplies, and set off into the unknown. The journey would be long, and the road ahead was filled with dangers they couldn't predict, but they had no choice but to move forward. With every step they took, the distance between them and their past grew larger. And for the first time since they had met, Jake felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them going. They would survive. Together. Jake and Lyra trudged through the snow, the cold biting at their skin as the wind howled around them. The landscape stretched out before them, vast and barren, with only the distant mountains to break the monotony of the endless white expanse. They had been walking for hours, each step a reminder of how far they had come and how much further they still had to go. The outpost was still a long way off, and the harsh conditions were taking their toll. Jake glanced at Lyra, her silver hair glinting in the weak sunlight, her face set with determination. Despite the cold and the physical exhaustion, there was a quiet strength in her demeanor that he admired. She had been through so much, yet she refused to let it break her. "We're making good time," Jake said, his voice carrying over the wind. Lyra didn't answer immediately, but her lips curled into a small smile. "As long as we stay ahead of the storm," she said, glancing up at the sky, which was beginning to darken. The forecast had predicted a blizzard, and it looked like it was starting to form in the distance. Jake quickened his pace, knowing they had to reach shelter before the storm hit. They couldn't afford to get caught in the open. The blizzard could be deadly, especially in these conditions. As they continued their trek, Jake's thoughts wandered back to the events that had led them here. He had never imagined that his simple act of kindness would set them on this path, but here they were, running from a powerful tribe and the looming threat of the Dominion. The Sarvani tribe had warned him, but he hadn't realized just how deep the danger ran. The Dominion was no ordinary force, it was an empire with resources and influence that spanned multiple systems. They had the power to crush anyone who defied them, and Jake knew that the Sarvani would not let him go without consequences. Yet, despite the looming danger, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. They were still alive. They were still fighting. And as long as they had each other, they had a chance. Lyra's quiet strength gave him the resolve to keep going, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. They had already faced so much, and they would face more before this was over. But he wouldn't let fear dictate their fate. He wouldn't give up. As the storm drew closer, Jake could see the outlines of the outpost in the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow. They were so close now, but the last stretch would be the hardest. The wind picked up, howling with fury, and the temperature dropped even further. Jake pulled his coat tighter around him, his breath coming in shallow gasps as they pushed forward. Lyra was still beside him, her pace steady despite the worsening conditions. She was stronger than she let on. The two of them pressed on, step by step, until they finally reached the outpost's entrance. The building stood tall and imposing, its metallic surface glinting in the fading light. Jake opened the door, and they stumbled inside, both of them gasping for breath. The warmth of the interior was a welcome relief, and Jake felt his muscles relax as the heat seeped into his bones. They had made it. They were safe, at least for now. Jake turned to Lyra, his face tired but filled with relief. "We made it," he said, his voice hoarse. Lyra nodded, her eyes bright despite the exhaustion. "We did." But even as she spoke, Jake could see the doubt in her eyes. They had made it to the outpost, but their journey was far from over. The Sarvani would come for them. The Dominion would not let them go. And they would have to find a way to survive in a universe that seemed determined to tear them apart. Jake and Lyra sat in the dimly lit interior of the outpost, the hum of the old machinery surrounding them like a constant reminder of their situation. The shelter was cold, the heat barely enough to keep the chill at bay, but it was shelter. It was a place to regroup, to plan, to survive. Jake leaned back against the wall, his eyes closed as he listened to the soft sounds of Lyra moving around. She was working quickly, setting up a small workstation with the supplies they had managed to gather. Despite the overwhelming weight of their predicament, she moved with the same quiet focus she always had. "We'll need to find a way to communicate," Lyra said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge of urgency to it. "The outpost has long-range communication equipment. If we can get it working, we might be able to contact anyone out there. Maybe even find a way off this planet." Jake nodded, though his mind was racing. They had made it this far, but he knew the hardest part was yet to come. The Sarvani tribe was still out there, and the Dominion would come for them. Sooner or later. Their small victory, their brief moment of safety, was just that, a moment. But as he watched Lyra work, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had become stronger in the days since their journey began. Her resolve had only solidified, and though the weight of her past still lingered, there was a glimmer of something more in her eyes. Hope. "You're right," Jake said finally, his voice steady. "We need to get that communication system online. We can't afford to wait around here forever." Lyra glanced over at him, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. "I know," she said softly. "But we have to be careful. If the Dominion finds out we're here, they won't hesitate to destroy this place. We need to be smart about this." Jake understood what she was saying. They couldn't just rush into anything. They needed to make sure they were prepared, that they had a plan. He had always been a man of action, but this situation was different. There was too much at stake. "We'll take it one step at a time," Jake said, more to himself than to her. "First, we get the comm system up and running. Then we figure out our next move." Lyra nodded, turning back to the equipment she was working on. Jake watched her for a moment, feeling a strange mixture of admiration and concern. She had become his anchor in this chaos, the one person he trusted without question. But even with that trust, there was still so much he didn't know. About her. About the Sarvani. About the Dominion. But for the first time since they had met, Jake felt a sense of clarity. No matter what came next, they would face it together. And that made all the difference. "We'll need to move quickly," Lyra said, breaking his thoughts. "I can get the system running, but we'll have to be careful when we use it. If they're tracking us, they'll know exactly where we are." Jake nodded, standing up from his spot by the wall. "We'll stay low, get in, get out. We don't stay here longer than we have to." He walked over to where Lyra was working, his eyes scanning the equipment. It was old, outdated, but it looked functional. "How long do you think it will take?" he asked. Lyra looked up, her brow furrowed in concentration. "A few hours, maybe less," she said. "But we'll need to run some tests before we send out any signals. I'll make sure everything is secure." Jake didn't like the idea of waiting, but he understood the need for caution. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. As Lyra worked, Jake kept watch, his mind running through possible scenarios. They were safe for now, but they both knew it wouldn't last. The Sarvani would come, and when they did, they would bring everything they had. Jake had a plan, but it was one he hoped he wouldn't have to put into action. They were running out of time. And the storm, both literal and figurative, was just beginning. Jake stood watch by the communication equipment, his eyes scanning the empty horizon through the cracked window of the outpost. The storm had finally passed, but the uncertainty still hung heavy in the air. Lyra had been busy for hours now, working diligently to get the old comm system operational. He could hear the soft hum of machinery, the occasional click and beep as she ran diagnostics. Despite the tension in the air, there was something almost calming about the rhythm of her movements. He knew they were running out of time, but for the moment, all he could do was wait. Lyra was focused, her brow furrowed as she made adjustments, fingers flying over the outdated console. Jake admired her determination. She had come a long way from the girl he had found in the snow. Now, she was more than just a survivor, she was a fighter, and together, they were a team. But even with her strength, Jake knew the dangers were far from over. The Dominion was still out there, and the Sarvani would not let them escape so easily. Every plan they made, every step they took, carried the weight of what was to come. The door to the outpost suddenly clicked open, pulling Jake from his thoughts. He turned to see Lyra standing in the doorway, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "It's ready," she said quietly, her voice steady but with an edge of exhaustion. "The comm system is online. But we have to move fast. I don't know how long we'll have before they detect the signal." Jake nodded, his heart racing at the thought of finally making contact. "Let's do it," he said, his voice firm. Lyra stepped aside, allowing him to approach the console. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it, their chance to escape, to reach out to whoever might help them. But there was no telling what would happen next. He sat down at the console, his fingers brushing the controls as he tried to steady his nerves. "I'll send the signal to the nearest outpost," Lyra said, her voice now softer, more vulnerable. "If they get the message, they'll send help. But it could take time. We have to be ready for anything." Jake nodded again, focusing on the screen. He keyed in the coordinates for the nearest station, praying that the signal would go through. The old system crackled to life, the faint sound of static filling the room before a quiet ping sounded. He exhaled, his body tensing. The signal was out. Now, all they could do was wait. Lyra stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the screen. "It's done," she said, her voice calm but tired. "Now we just wait." Jake stood up, his muscles aching from the long hours of travel and the stress of the past few days. "Now we wait," he repeated, though his mind was already racing. Waiting was never easy. But in this case, it was all they could do. They both turned toward the small window, watching the barren landscape outside. The planet was silent, almost too silent. The occasional gust of wind was the only sound that broke the stillness. Jake couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. The future was uncertain, and they had no idea what would happen next. But in that moment, they had each other. That had to be enough. The days ahead would be hard. But Jake was ready to face them, with Lyra by his side. They would survive. Together.